violence in the South, which had existed since the Civil War because of white supremacists' opposition to the giving of citizenship rights to the former slaves. So it was not a tranquil year, that's for sure.
1876 was also a presidential election year. And all of these issues, plus the rampant corruption in the administration of outgoing President Ulysses S. Grant, would factor into the contest. The Republicans ran Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes. Was he charismatic?
I wouldn't say
You
so.
see him with his hand.
This is a
See
spectacular
how he had
portrait.
his
Yeah, Hayes joked that he wanted a porch with a house attached.
hand inside his jacket.
It's
It's that
at the
Freemason.
Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center in Fremont, Ohio.
He really exemplified that American tradition of the office seeks you, you don't seek it.
We have kind of the trifecta over here. We have General Grant, General Sherman, General Sheridan.
All great Union generals.
Yes, and all from Ohio as well.
Hayes's service as a general during the Civil War, says the center's executive director, Christy Weininger, was central to his identity.
He saw firsthand the passions that were behind the sectionalism that caused the Civil War. So I think that was always in the back of his mind is how do we make this country feel united again?
Meanwhile, the Democrats were hungry to reclaim the White House, which they hadn't won in 20 years. Their candidate, New York Governor Samuel Tilden, a bachelor lawyer, had made his name fighting big city corruption.
Tilden and Hendricks, with Tilden and Hendricks, hurrah for Tilden and Hendricks.
The man was a bit lethargic, and quite frankly, a lot of people thought he was dull. Dull but dedicated. His home sat across from New York City's Gramercy Park and is today the National Arts Club, overseen by Robert Yonner. I have to tell you, this house is kind of nicer than the White House. This house is a great Tilden legacy. While both had beautiful homes, neither candidate, says Eric Foner, was exactly Mount Rushmore material.
There's another way of putting it. Both of them were basically mediocrities, politically.
Still, the turnout that November 7th remains the highest ever for a presidential election. The turnout was 82% of eligible voters. That's extraordinary.
You had two political parties competing throughout the nation with people very loyal to them.
On election night, Tilden was ahead in the popular vote by 260,000 votes.
Hayes actually goes to bed believing Tilden had won, and he actually has interviews with reporters saying, I have lost. The Republican Party has to step in and tell him to stop saying that.
That's because Republican officials still saw a narrow path to victory for Hayes.
If Hayes could carry the three southern states where the results were not yet clear, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, he would win by one electoral vote. And they just issued a statement. Hayes has carried those states and is elected. And in a certain sense, it's almost like the 2000 election where Bush made an early claim of victory, even though it was so divided, and Gore never quite contested it properly.
And just as in the year 2000, America in 1876 woke up the morning after the election not knowing who had won. Inauguration back then was in early March, which meant the country had 4 months to figure out who would be its 19th president.
This election was flawed from top to bottom.
Massive voter fraud, says Foner, only added to the confusion.
There was violence throughout the South against African American voters to try to make it impossible for them to vote.
Black men, almost all of whom were Republican back then, had only recently won the right to vote, and Southern Democrats were actively suppressing that vote.
If there had been a fair election in the South, there's no question Hayes would have won by a large margin.
But as the weeks dragged on, neither side was willing to concede. How tense did it get?
There were Democratic newspapers with headlines, "March to Washington to install Tilden as president." There were Republicans saying, "We're on the verge of another civil war."
Tilden or blood. This idea that if Tilden's not counted in, we might have another war, to fight here.
Was there a fear that there could be dueling presidencies?
Yes, there were key Democrats who asked Tilden to take the oath of office anyway. He refused to do so.
And there were a lot of people who said, particularly businessmen and others,
The
who said,
oath
we
of
don't even
office.
care who's elected, but get this settled.
But Congress was divided, and the Constitution offered no clear direction for resolving the impasse. So in January of 1877, a 15-member electoral commission was formed. The 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats would determine which candidate won the states in dispute.
By some coincidence, all the electoral votes are allocated to Hayes by a vote of 8-7 in each case.
That's right, the commission voted along party lines. But it's not over yet.
It's not over yet.
The Tilden camp cried foul.
What?
With inauguration just days away and
What?
the nation on edge, representatives for both candidates met in Washington for secret negotiations.
Ironically, they took place at Wormley House, a major hotel which is owned by a black man. Wormley, probably the most well-to-do African-American in the city of Washington at that time.
Ironic, because the agreement forged there, known as the Compromise of 1877, would have long-lasting repercussions for black Americans in the South.
The Democrats will not stop the inauguration of Hayes. They will accept Hayes as president. Hayes will end the remaining Reconstruction.
In other words, the Republicans get the White House. The Democrats effectively regain control of the American South. No more federal protection of the rights of recently freed African Americans.
The Democrats promise they will respect the basic rights of the former slaves, which they do not do.
Rutherford B. Hayes was certified as president on March 2, 1877. Samuel Tilden accepted the decision. 3 days later, Hayes was inaugurated in a peaceful transfer of power.
I think if either Hayes or Tilden had been of the personality that was very aggressive, that was very intense, really wanted this presidency for very selfish reasons, I think the whole tenor would have changed.
Today,
Selfish
says Christy
reasons.
Weininger, President Hayes is remembered less for what he did during his single term in office than for the election that threatened, once again, to tear apart the country. Are visitors bringing up the election of 1876 more?
They're very interested in how divisive the country was then. And somehow knowing that we've been there before and survived, I think gives some comfort and some hope to people.
In an election year